The first thing you need to understand is that a lemon rust doesn't sleep. The engine idles with a particular shudder, a grinding vibration that travels up through the deck plates and into your spine, your jaw, the soft tissue behind your eyes. After 6 hours, you stop noticing it. After 12, it becomes the only sound in the universe. After 72, you realize it's been replacing your heartbeat, one piston stroke at a time. We'd been advancing for 11 days through what the commissariat maps called the Ashfeld Barrens, though there was nothing barren about it except hope. The ground was a grey-black crust that cracked under our treads like the shell of something long dead, releasing pale vapor that smelled of rendered fat and sulfur. Command called it volcanic residue. Trooper Helm said it was crematorium ash from the hive cities the enemy had burned 6 months prior, millions of souls powdered and scattered, and that we were grinding them finer with every kilometer. I told him to shut his mouth. I was crew chief then. I could tell people to shut their mouths. Our tank was designated Iron Testament, though Sergeant Vordek had scratched Emperor's Mercy into the glacis plate with a combat knife during our second engagement, back when we still believed in mercy. We were 5th in a column of 12, part of the 19th Armored Regiment, 3rd Company, advancing to reinforce a garrison that probably didn't exist anymore. The Vox had been crackling with ghost signals for days, half words in voices that might have been human, coordinates that led to empty craters, pleas for extraction from positions our maps insisted were underwater. Vordek drove. He'd been driving Lehman Russes for 16 years, and his hands had molded themselves to the control levers, fingers permanently curled even when he slept. Helm operated the turret, his tall frame folded into that cramped space like an insect in a jar. Trooper Cathay managed the Vox and auxiliary weapons, her face always pressed against the vision block, counting the endless grey horizon. And then there was me, Trooper Marish Volk, acting crew chief because the actual chief had caught a shell fragment through the eye slit 3 weeks prior, and someone had to tell the Emperor's prayer machine where to point its hate. I remember the last thing I saw before we were surrounded. It was a tree. Not a real tree, a sculpture of one. Maybe. Or a shrine, 15 meters tall, constructed entirely from human bones, bound together with wire and what looked like partially melted rubber. Femurs for the trunk, ribs spreading out like branches, skulls clustered at the top like some obscene fruit. It stood alone in that wasteland, and as we passed it, I saw that each skull had been positioned to face the same direction, tracking our movement. Someone had taken the time to arrange them that way. Someone had cared about the details. "What is that?" Cathay asked over the internal Vox, her voice tight. "Don't look at it," Vordek said. "Just another marker. They're trying to get in our heads." But I was looking at it. I couldn't stop looking at it, even as we rolled past, even as the dust plume from our treads obscured it. Because I'd counted the skulls visible from our angle, 47 of them, and I'd recognized 3. Trooper Grent, from the 8th Company, identified by the distinctive crack across his forehead from a training accident. Medicae Suster Yenny, her skull still showing the augmetic anchor points where her field surgical array had been mounted. And someone else, someone whose name I'd forgotten but whose face I could still picture, laughing at some joke in the regimental canteen a lifetime ago. The bone tree disappeared behind us. I didn't mention the recognition. What would have been the point? The ambush came at 14:47 local time, 3 minutes after we'd crested a low ridge and begun descending into what our auspex insisted was an empty valley. The lead tank, Faithful Servant, simply ceased to exist. One moment it was there, a 50-ton mass of ceramite and prayer, and the next there was a column of black smoke reaching toward the ashen sky, and pieces of tread spinning through the air like parade banners. No explosion, no warning, just transition from presence to absence. Then the entire valley floor erupted. They came up through the ash itself, through camouflaged fighting positions we'd driven directly over, through tunnels and hides and carefully prepared killing zones. Not the green-skinned monsters we'd been briefed to expect. Not the insectoid horrors from the training picts. These were human, or had been. They wore a patchwork of uniforms, Imperial Guard fatigues mixed with civilian clothes mixed with bare skin covered in scars and brands. Their faces were wrong in ways I still can't fully articulate. Too symmetrical, eyes too wide, mouths that opened just a degree too far when they screamed. And they had brought their own armor, not proper vehicles but things constructed from salvage, from our own destroyed tanks, from agricultural equipment and industrial machinery welded together into shapes that almost made sense. I saw one that appeared to be built around the chassis of a Lehman Russ, but they'd mounted the turret backward and added 6 additional weapon mounts that sprouted from the hull like tumors. It moved with a horrible organic fluidity, as if the machine were learning to walk. The Vox erupted with shouting. Vordek was already reversing, our engine screaming, but the valley had become a meat grinder. I saw Righteous Fury take 3 direct hits to its side armor and begin burning. Crew hatches popping open, figures emerging wreathed in flame. I saw Emperor's blade attempt to climb the valley slope and tip backward, belly armor exposed, a dozen shapes swarming over it like ants, prying at the hatches with crowbars and torches. All units, form defensive circle. That was Captain Helmut, his voice distorted by static and what sounded like his own blood. Defensive circle. Protect the transmission ended in a sound I'd never heard before and never want to hear again. Like metal screaming. Like a human throat trying to form words in a language made of grinding gears. We formed our circle, those of us who survived the first 5 minutes, at least. 6 tanks, arranged with guns facing outward, treads nearly touching. Iron Testament ended up positioned on the western arc. Our glacis plate, facing a low berm where I could see shapes moving. Preparing, Vordek had wedged us between Wrath Divine and Emperor's Testament, giving us some protection on the flanks. Not enough. Never enough. The first hour was pure violence. They attacked in waves, human figures running at us through the ash, some carrying explosives, some carrying nothing but their own willingness to die. We fired until the battle cannon ran dry, until the sponson weapons glowed cherry red, until my ears bled and the air inside our tank became a toxic soup of propellant fumes and vaporized metal. Helm was screaming something over and over, but I couldn't make it out through the Vox distortion. Cathay was crying, though her hands never stopped moving, loading shells, adjusting targeting solutions, doing her duty, even as her face crumpled. When the first wave broke, I counted our circle. 6 tanks, 30 personnel, approximately, if everyone had survived, against an enemy force that I'd estimated, during the clearest moment of the engagement, at somewhere between 300 and 800. The math was simple. The math was wrong. The math didn't matter. That's when I realized we'd been had. This wasn't an ambush meant to destroy us. If they'd wanted that, they could have done it in the opening minutes. This was a trap meant to hold us, to fix us in place. And the question that began burning in my mind, the question that would become my companion for the next 71 hours, was, what were they waiting for? The second hour brought the quiet. They pulled back beyond effective weapon range, and we were left sitting in our circle, engines idling, counting ammunition, trying to raise command on the Vox. Nothing. Every channel was filled with that same screaming metal sound, occasionally interrupted by what might have been voices speaking low Gothic backward, words that almost made sense if you listened too long. Vordek's hands were shaking on the levers. I'd never seen that before. We should make a break for it, Helm said. His voice was raw from screaming. Punch through while they're regrouping. We'd make it 20 meters, I said. Look at the terrain. He looked. We all looked. While we'd been fighting, they'd been working. The valley floor around us was now studded with metal spikes, angled to tear through treads, shallow pits filled with what looked like industrial acid, pale liquid that smoked in the cold air. And beyond that, I could see them bringing up more weapons. Heavy weapons. Patient weapons. Then we fight here, Carther said. We hold until relief arrives. Nobody responded to that. Relief wasn't coming. We all knew it. The entire regimental advance had been shattered. We were a pocket of resistance in an ocean of enemy territory, and the enemy had learned something about patience, about strategy, about taking their time to savor victory. But there was something else, something in the way they'd positioned themselves, in the careful arrangement of their forces. They weren't just surrounding us, they were watching us, studying us, and I kept thinking about that bone tree, about the care taken in its construction, about the message it was meant to send. Someone out there was trying to teach us something. The third hour brought the bodies. They didn't attack, they simply brought their dead forward, the casualties from their first wave, and arranged them in rows facing our circle. Dozens of them, hundreds. They laid them out with geometric precision, creating patterns I couldn't quite interpret. Some of the bodies were intact. Many weren't. They'd mixed in parts from our destroyed tanks, a section of tread here, a piece of hull plating there, integrating metal and flesh into arrangements that looked almost decorative. "What are they doing?" Cathay asked. "Building something," Vordek said. His voice had gone flat. "Don't look at it too long." But I was looking. I couldn't help looking. Because in the arrangement of those bodies, in the specific placement of each corpse and component, I was starting to see a shape, a symbol, something vast and deliberate that we were positioned at the center of, like the pupil of a great eye. Helm fired a burst from the turret at the nearest cluster of bodies. The heavy bolter rounds tore through flesh and scattered the arrangement. For maybe 30 seconds, I felt a surge of defiant satisfaction. Then they sent out new workers, new bodies, and rebuilt the pattern exactly as it had been. Not approximately. Exactly. Every corpse returned to its previous position. Every piece of metal replaced with geometric precision. And I realized that Helm's burst hadn't disrupted anything. It had been accounted for, expected, perhaps even desired. "Cease fire," I said. "Don't waste ammunition." But there, I said cease fire. The fourth hour brought hunger. We'd been carrying 3 days of rations, meant for the advance, but nobody had been thinking about food during the ambush. Now, sitting in the relative quiet, our bodies began making demands. I distributed the ration bar's standard Imperial Guard issue, compressed protein and carbohydrate that tasted like salted cardboard and provided exactly enough nutrition to keep a soldier functional. We ate in silence, listening to the engine idle, listening to the Vox crackle with its ghost voices. Outside, they continued their work. The body symbol was growing larger. They'd brought in more corpses, more metal, expanding the pattern. I could see small fires burning at specific points, marking what I assumed were significant positions in their design. The smoke rose straight up in the windless air, columns of black against grey. "Water's going to be a problem," Cather said. "We've got maybe 2 days if we ration it strictly." "We won't last 2 days," Helm muttered. "Shut up," I said. Then, because I was crew chief, and it was my job to maintain morale, I added, "We hold. We survive. Relief will come." The lie tasted worse than the ration bar. The fifth hour brought the sermon. One of them, a woman, I think, though her face had been altered in ways that made gender almost irrelevant, approached within shouting distance of our circle. She was unarmed, hands spread, wearing what looked like an Imperial missionary's robes that had been turned inside out and sewn back together with wire. She began to speak, not Low Gothic, not any language I recognized. But somehow I understood it anyway, the words bypassing my ears and arriving directly in my mind, in that place where thought becomes feeling, becomes certainty. She was telling us about transformation, about the weakness of flesh and the strength of what lay beyond flesh, about how we were blessed, chosen to participate in a great work, selected for our purity to become something more than the Emperor's discarded tools. "Shut it down," Vordek said. "Don't listen." But we were listening, all of us. The words had a rhythm, a cadence that matched the engine's idle, that synced with the grinding vibration in our bones. She was telling us that we'd been lied to, that the Imperium we served was a vast machine that consumed its children, that the only escape was through transcendence, through willing participation in something older and truer than the Emperor's false divinity. Helm fired. The heavy bolter round caught her center mass and removed everything from sternum to pelvis. She fell backward, and the sermon ended, for about 10 seconds. Then another figure approached. Identical robes, identical hand gestures. The sermon resumed exactly where it had left off. Same words, same rhythm, as if the first speaker had simply paused for breath. Helm fired again. Another body fell. Another speaker emerged. "Stop shooting them," I said. "But they want you to shoot them. Can't you see? Every round you waste is one less we have for when they actually attack." The sermon continued. We sat in our tank and listened to promises of transformation, of release from duty, of becoming something greater than human. The words scraped against the inside of my skull like rust flaking off old metal. Hour 6, Hour 7, Hour 8. The sermon never stopped. They rotated speakers, bringing up new ones as the previous ones grew hoarse or collapsed from exhaustion. The words began to change, to evolve, incorporating details they couldn't possibly know. They spoke about my childhood on an agri world whose name I'd stopped saying years ago. They described Kathy's first kill, the way the enemy soldier's face had looked in the moment before her bayonet found his throat. They recounted Vordek's dreams, the specific recurring nightmare about drowning in lubricant oil while the Emperor watched and did nothing. "They're in our heads," Helm whispered. "They're reading us. They're guessing," I said. "Psychological warfare. Don't give them the satisfaction." But they weren't guessing. Every detail was perfect, every memory accurate. They were pulling out the things we'd buried, the doubts we'd suppressed, the questions we'd learned not to ask, and beneath it all, that central proposition: transformation, transcendence. The promise of becoming something that didn't hurt, didn't hunger, didn't fear. Outside, the body symbol was nearly complete. From my vision block, I could see that we were positioned at its exact center, 6 tanks arranged in a shape that mirrored the greater pattern. We'd been incorporated into their design from the beginning. We'd driven into their trap thinking we were the predators, and instead we'd become the final component in something vast and patient. I checked our ammunition. 6 battle cannon rounds remaining, maybe 400 rounds for the heavy bolter. Enough for one more serious engagement. Not enough for what was coming. Hour 12 brought the first casualty from within our circle. The Vox crackled with a sound like laughter. And then Trooper Guinness from Emperor's Testament was screaming. Not words, just sound. His crew reported that he'd suddenly begun clawing at his own face, tearing away skin, trying to dig into his skull with his fingernails. They restrained him, but the screaming didn't stop. It went on for 40 minutes, gradually changing pitch and tone, until it no longer sounded like a human throat producing it. Then silence. "Jens is dead," Lieutenant Carth reported over the Vox. "Cause unknown. Possible contamination." But we all knew it wasn't contamination. The sermon had found a weakness, a crack in Guinness's mental armor, and it had pried him open. And now we were 5 tanks and 29 personnel, and we all understood that the enemy didn't need to kill us with bullets. They could simply wait for us to break ourselves apart. I looked at Carth. Her eyes were wide, pupils dilated. I could see her lips moving, and I realized she was praying. Not the standard Imperial litanies. Something else. Something older. I reached out and grabbed her hand. "Stay with me," I said. "Focus on your duty." She nodded, but her hand was cold, and her pulse was hammering against my palm like something trying to escape. Hour 15, Hour 18, Hour 21. The sermon continued. The body symbol grew more elaborate, incorporating new elements, pieces of equipment we'd abandoned, personal effects that had somehow been retrieved from our destroyed tanks, items that had no business being out there in enemy hands. They were building a portrait of us, I realized. A 3-dimensional representation of everything we were, everything we'd been, everything we feared becoming. And we sat at its center like specimens in a collection, alive but catalogued, breathing but classified. Vordek's hands had stopped shaking. They'd gone completely still on the control levers, and when I looked at his face, I saw that he was smiling. Not a happy smile, a rictus, the expression of someone who'd seen the punchline to a joke he'd been living inside of for 16 years. "Vordek," I said. "Talk to me." "They're right," he said softly. "About all of it. We're already dead. We've been dead since we took the oath. We just keep moving, because nobody told us we could stop. That's the sermon talking. Don't listen to. The Emperor doesn't love us, Marish. The Emperor doesn't even know we exist. We're ammunition. We're fired and forgotten. I should have said something. Should have delivered some inspiring speech about duty and sacrifice and the glory of service. But my mouth was dry. My throat was closing. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice that sounded like my own was whispering that Vordek was right. That we'd all known it was right. That the sermon was simply saying aloud what we'd been thinking in the dark hours before dawn for our entire service. "Keep driving," I said finally. "That's all. Just keep driving." Hour 24 brought the first hallucination. Helm reported seeing figures inside the tank with us. Shadows that moved independently of our movements. Shapes that flickered in peripheral vision. Kathy insisted she could hear children crying somewhere in the ventilation system, though our Lehman Russ had no ventilation system, just a simple air scrubber that wheezed and rattled. I saw my dead mother standing in the corner where the ammunition was stored, wearing her best clothes, the ones we'd burned her in, telling me quietly that she was disappointed in the man I'd become. "Nobody react to what they're seeing," I said, over internal vox. "These are hallucinations caused by stress and toxin buildup. They're not real." But the line between real and unreal was becoming porous. The sermon had been going on for 24 hours straight, and my brain was starting to interpret its rhythm as meaning. I found myself nodding along to certain passages, agreeing with particular points, considering the logic of transformation, the mercy of transcendence, the kindness of becoming something that didn't have to make choices anymore. Outside, they began to dance. Not the enemy soldiers. The bodies, the corpses that formed the symbol. They rose and began moving, swaying in unison, arms lifting and falling in patterns that matched the sermon's cadence. It was impossible. It was undeniable. I watched through the vision block as hundreds of dead bodies performed a synchronized movement that looked almost like prayer. "Are you seeing this?" I asked. "Yes," Katha whispered. "Yes," Helm said. "Yes," Vordek said. So it wasn't a hallucination. Or we were all hallucinating the same thing. Or the distinction no longer mattered. Hour 30 brought mutation. One of the crew from Wrath Divine, I never learned his name, climbed out of his tank and walked into the enemy lines. Just stood up, popped the hatch, and walked away. His crew shouted for him to stop, but he didn't even pause. He walked through the dancing corpses, through the enemy soldiers who parted to let him pass, until he reached a specific point in the body symbol's design. Then he lay down and didn't move. They left him there for 2 hours. Then they came with tools and wire and began incorporating him into the pattern, still alive, binding him to the corpses and metal, in a configuration I couldn't fully see but could sense was significant. His screaming lasted for 20 minutes. Then he began speaking in the same voice as the sermon givers, continuing their message, adding his own testimony about release and transformation and the joy of becoming component. That's when I understood the truth. This wasn't torture. This was recruitment. They were showing us what we could become, what we would become. The sermon, the symbol, the dancing dead, all of it, was an elaborate demonstration. A preview of our inevitable transformation from soldiers into something that served a different kind of empire, one that didn't waste its personnel, but preserved them, recycled them, gave them new purpose in eternal service. "We need to fight," Helm said. His voice had gone high and thin. "We need to kill them. We need to—" "Quiet," I said. "Need to show them we're not afraid. Need to prove that." I hit him. Open palm across the face, hard enough to snap his head sideways. He stopped talking. stared at me with eyes that had started to look like the enemy's eyes, too wide, too symmetrical, too ready to open all the way and reveal whatever was growing behind them. "We hold," I said. "We survive. That's all. Hour 36. Hour 40. Hour 45. Water ran out. We'd been rationing it carefully. But 5 people breathing the same recycled air, sweating in the heat of the engine, burning calories just by existing, we'd gone through our supply faster than projected. Cathay suggested we could drink coolant from the engine. Helm suggested we didn't need water if we were going to die anyway. Vordek suggested nothing because Vordek had stopped speaking entirely, just sat at the controls with his permanent smile and his still hands. The sermon offered us water, promised us we'd never thirst again if we accepted transformation, explained that biological needs were artifacts of our weakness, symptoms of our incomplete state. The body symbol, now fully formed, pulsed with an inner light that seemed to come from the corpses themselves, as if they were generating their own illumination through some process I didn't want to understand. My mouth was so dry I could hear my tongue scraping against my teeth. My lips had cracked and begun bleeding. I licked the blood and it tasted like copper and salt and defeat. Hour 50 brought the second defection, Lieutenant Karth from Emperor's Testament. He didn't walk out. He drove out, started his engine, broke from the circle, and headed directly toward the enemy lines. The other tanks could have stopped him, should have stopped him, but nobody fired. We just watched as the lemon rust rolled through the body symbol, crushing the carefully arranged corpses, destroying hours of work. They didn't try to stop him either. They opened a path and let him through, his tank disappearing into the ash haze beyond our visual range. For a brief, wild moment, I thought maybe he'd found an escape route. Maybe he'd make it. Maybe. The explosion came 5 minutes later. Not the sound of a battle cannon or a mine. Something else. Something wet. And then the screaming started, broadcast over all Vox channels. Karth's voice and his crew's voices mixing together, overlapping, harmonizing in a chorus that described what was happening to them, the transformation they were experiencing, the beautiful agony of becoming more than human. The screaming lasted for 6 hours. It's still continuing, actually. Even now. Even after everything. Some screams don't end just because the throat producing them has been fundamentally restructured. We were down to 4 tanks, maybe 20 personnel. I'd lost count. Time was becoming unreliable. My vision block showed me things that couldn't be real. The ash itself was moving now, flowing in currents that formed shapes, faces, words written in dust that blew away before I could read them, but left their meaning imprinted somehow directly on my brain. Hour 55. Hour 60. Hour 65. Food ran out. Ammunition ran low. 3 rounds for the battle cannon, maybe 50 for the heavy bolter. The engine was still running, consuming fuel we couldn't spare, but stopping it would be an admission that we weren't going anywhere, that we'd never been going anywhere, that this had been our destination all along. Helm had started talking to the hallucinations, holding long conversations with people who weren't there. Cathay had pulled out a knife and was carving symbols into her own arm, carefully, precisely, marks that looked disturbingly similar to the patterns in the body symbol outside. Vordek was still smiling. I was starting to understand why. The sermon had changed. It was no longer trying to convince us. It had moved past argument into certainty, speaking to us as if our transformation were already complete, as if we'd already made the decision and just hadn't informed our bodies yet. It described what we would become, the specific modifications we'd receive, the roles we'd play in the greater design. I would become a navigator, it said. My eyes would be replaced with augmetic sensors that could see through ash and smoke and time itself. I would guide future vehicles into future traps with perfect precision. I would do this forever. Cathay would become a sculptor. Her hands would be augmented with tools that never dulled, never tired. She would arrange bodies and metal into symbols, each one a message, each one a prayer, each one a trap for the next group of soldiers who thought they were advancing to victory. Helm would become a preacher. His throat would be modified to produce the sermon endlessly, without rest, his voice joining the chorus of all the others who'd been transformed before him, creating a sound that would break minds and prepare souls for their own transcendence. Vordek would become a driver, but not for a tank, for something else, something larger. The sermon didn't specify, but I could sense the shape of it, the vast mobile cathedral of flesh and metal that required drivers who understood machinery, not as separate from themselves, but as extensions of their deepest being. And all of this was said not as threat, but as promise, as gift, as the natural culmination of our service, the reward we'd been moving toward from the moment we took our oaths and climbed into our tanks and pretended we were anything more than raw material waiting to be processed. Hour 70 brought acceptance. I can't pinpoint the exact moment. There was no dramatic realization, no sudden break, just a gradual understanding that the sermon was right, that resistance was a form of denial, that the only way out was through transformation, and transformation was not death but evolution, not ending but beginning. The enemy hadn't surrounded us to kill us. They'd surrounded us to save us. I looked at my crew. Heln had stopped talking to his hallucinations and was staring at the hatch, expression peaceful. Cathay had finished her carvings and was holding her knife loosely, no longer cutting, no longer bleeding, just waiting. Vordek's smile had softened into something almost genuine. We could open the hatch, I said. Nobody responded. We could walk out, join them. They're offering us something. Maybe it's better than this. Yes, Cathay said softly. Yes, Helm said. Vordek just nodded, his smile widening. My hand moved to the hatch release. The metal was warm under my palm. Outside, I could hear the sermon reaching a crescendo, all the voices harmonizing, all the bodies swaying in perfect rhythm, the entire symbol pulsing with light and meaning and invitation. I pulled the release. Hour 71 brought salvation. The artillery strike came from a direction I hadn't thought to watch. Not from command, not from our regiment, from the planetary defense batteries, ancient weapons systems that had sat dormant for centuries, suddenly activated by someone who understood what was happening in this valley, someone who understood that there are some transformations that must be prevented at any cost. The first shell landed directly in the center of the body symbol. The explosion was white-hot, purifying, loud enough to temporarily deafen even through our armor. Then came the second, the third, the 20th. They walked the barrage across the entire valley floor, methodically destroying everything, enemy soldiers and corpses and symbols and promises alike. Our tank rocked with the impacts. Shrapnel screamed against our hull. The sermon was drowned in thunder. And in that moment, with my hand on the hatch release, with salvation literally raining from the sky, I felt something inside me howl in protest. Not relief, not gratitude, but fury, denial, the rage of someone who'd been shown a door to something greater and had it slammed in their face. I wanted to go back out there. I wanted to finish what I'd started. I wanted to become what I'd been promised. The artillery continued for 40 minutes. When it stopped, the valley was transformed, not into symbol, but into crater, not into meaning, but into erasure. The body symbol was gone. The enemy was scattered. The sermon had ended. We were saved. Hour 72 brought the rescue. The relief column found us at dawn of the fourth day. 20 fresh tanks, 500 soldiers, Medicae units, and a commissar who looked at our 4 surviving vehicles and immediately ordered us quarantined. They pulled us from our tanks with rough efficiency, stripped us, examined us, asked us questions we couldn't answer because the words wouldn't form properly. I tried to explain about the sermon, about the transformation, about the choice we'd almost made, but my tongue felt thick and wrong in my mouth, and the sounds I produced didn't match the meanings I intended. The Medicae gave me something that made everything soft and distant. They told us later that we'd been exposed to a specialized form of corruption, that the enemy had been using us as bait, yes, but also as experiment, testing a new method of recruitment that worked on the mind before the body. that we were lucky to have survived with our souls relatively intact, that we were heroes. But I know the truth. I know what I felt in that moment before the artillery came. I know what I wanted. They've assigned us to new tanks now. New crews. They think we can return to service, that we can be useful soldiers again. And maybe we can. Maybe we will. But every time I sit in a crew chief's position, every time I feel that familiar grinding vibration traveling up through the deck plates and into my spine, I hear echoes. The sermon hasn't ended. It just moved inside. It lives in the engine's idle now, in the shudder and grind of metal on metal. It speaks in a voice that sounds like my own thoughts, reminding me of what I was promised, what I could have become, what I still might become if I just make that same choice again, if I just open the hatch and walk out and accept the gift that's still waiting, will always be waiting, patient and eternal and true. They tell me I'm a hero. They tell me I survived. But survival isn't a virtue when you've seen what lies on the other side. When you've understood that the only real horror is being pulled back, being forced to remain human, being denied the mercy of transformation. My name is Marish Volk. I'm a crew chief in the Imperial Guard. I serve the Emperor with all my being. And I'm lying. I'm lying because the truth is that I served the Emperor once, but now I serve something else, something I glimpsed in that valley, something that's still waiting for me to finish what I started. And every day I spend in this tank, pretending to be loyal, pretending to be whole, is just another form of service to that patient. Perfect thing. The lemon Russ doesn't sleep. The engine idles with its particular shudder, and in that shudder, in that endless grinding vibration, I hear the sermon continuing, counting down the days until I can return to that valley, or one like it, and finally complete my transformation. They think they rescued me. But rescue and capture are the same thing, really. Just different words for the same trap. And I'm still surrounded. I've been surrounded for 72 hours, and for all the hours since, and for all the hours to come. I just haven't opened the hatch yet. But I will.